Great to see so many people back together. My name is Marco. I'll be moderating it today, and we're going to be doing things slightly differently today. But before we get started, just a little bit about the history, how we got together. So many years ago, Jenny Blackburn from then Salesforce approached Rajan from LinkedIn, myself, a couple other people, and basically said, hey, there's a lack of community for people like us. And we're like, well, what do you mean like us? And so basically her observation was that there's not the technical learning and development in technology companies or for technical folks tends to be slightly different. Like it's not the traditional L&D. And she's basically suggested, let's get together and share how we do things intimately with one another. And so we did that, and then the group was called TechLearn. And then in 2018, we got together again and said, hey, why don't we create an annual gathering? And so we did that in 2018 at LinkedIn for the first time, and had 100 plus people show up from basically who's who of Silicon Valley, L&D. And then the following year, we had the same thing at Twitter, 2019, so last year, and it was pretty awesome as well. All amazing speakers, great knowledge sharing among ourselves. Got to meet our tribe essentially. So it was wonderful. And then 2020, we were planning to do the annual again, but then COVID happened, and we said, hey, why don't we move this to online, to the Zoom experience, try it out in a form of a roundtable. So here's us again back on a monthly basis. So that's kind of how we came about. So really quickly, we have a couple of community guidelines. So again, this is a community for us, by us. So we sort of try to keep it a safe place. And the objective is to be that safe place where we learn and get inspired from one another. So, be kind, open-minded, share yourself, respect people's privacy. Generally, there's no non-solicitation policy, so do not pitch things. We're here to learn. We have a little bit of a governance board. We came up with this slide essentially, and it's Katie from Twitter, John from LinkedIn, Chris from Microsoft, me, and Andrew from Shopify. And this is the link to the details. And with that, I'd love to introduce Kristina Norris from GitHub. So I've had a pleasure to work with Kristina a couple of years back on some very fun projects. And what always got me really interested in GitHub culture is the fact that they're so distributed from day one, right? So Office was a fallback to otherwise a distributed work environment at scale, and all this they had all this before COVID. So if you kind of think about the levels of remote work, GitHub is at the level 4, level 5. Where most of the rest of America is like level 1 going to level 2, right? So they're ahead of the curve when it comes to being remote. So Kristina is going to talk about bringing community together during these uncertain times. So with that, I'll just pass it on to Kristina. I'm going to stop sharing.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Marco. I really appreciate it. And yeah, I think it's helpful for me to share a little bit about myself, especially as I get my other screen up here. But before I do, can I just see some thumbs up if you can see my slides? Awesome, thank you. So yeah, I work for GitHub. I've been working for GitHub for a little over 4 years now. It's felt like a lifetime, as I'm sure many of you feel in your own roles. I specialized and was the head of learning and development before I recently have pivoted into an HR business partner role in the last 2 weeks. So still learning that. But a little bit about me is that I'm originally from Boston. I live in San Francisco now, and really gravitated towards GitHub's culture of remote first, largely because I believed in the way that we could bring community together in these virtual experiences. And like Marco said, it was before COVID, before we had to. I recognized that, my family didn't want to jump on FaceTime, or, my friends were, well, I'd pick up a call and they'd ask me why I wasn't texting them, for example. And And when I interviewed with GitHub, it was different. There was something different about it. And it was largely because they didn't have me come into their office. They didn't try to, I mean, the office was pretty cool in San Francisco, but that's not their selling point, right? It was the fact that everyone had their screens on, that you got to see a little part of themselves at their home, what you all experienced here, right? And everyone showed up as their own individual, no matter what part of the interview process I was in. But they recognized that their remote first culture was something that was really important to them. So today I'm going to talk a little bit about the uncertain times that we've all experienced more recently, but I would imagine what we'll continue to feel as we go through these movements of change. But one thing that has stayed true, at least at GitHub, is really our distributed workforce. So we're a global company. We have mostly been, I want to say about 75% remote first, which means that someone is not working or is working from their home office, wherever their home may be. Back when I first started at GitHub, we had plenty of digital nomads, and now we have to be a little more conscious about what states people are working in, what countries, you know, all of those specifics, so that way we're staying in compliance guidelines. But really, the biggest things that have helped GitHub be a leader in this remote first space is their high priority around documentation. Basically, if there's a conversation that's happening live like this, there's an expectation that someone's putting up notes and putting it in a repo. A repo is essentially a folder for anyone that's not familiar with GitHub. And so the thought is that you can always go back to these notes, even if you weren't present there. And the reason why documentation is so important is for transparency. I mean, we live for our product, right? We're an open source product for a reason. If you're not in the time zone, that doesn't mean you should be exclusive for the decision-making process, right? So setting up examples and ways that we can work collaboratively as a human race rather than a national, you know, pride has been really important to GitHub. And some other ways that we've thought about, you know, really prioritizing that, you know, remote first is making sure that if managers are responsible for team members that are outside of their time zone, especially maybe in countries that are largely different in time zones, that they create some kind of working agreements. So there's not any kind of bias or recency or proximity bias. And when you're evaluating their performance in the long run, setting some really clear examples of saying, hey, look, you know, I'll need 24 hours. Whereas if it was your partner sitting next to you in a desk, you might be able to get it a lot sooner, and making sure that those agreements aligned up and those expectations, especially when you go into performance reviews. And then it was the small things, right? Like seeing someone's face on Zoom it helps you feel so much more connected. I don't know if you all are feeling that way, especially us staying inside our homes for months at a time. It's nice to see a new face. It's nice to see a new smile. It helps you feel connected, and it helps, if nothing else, bring you back to the reason why you hopefully work for the company that you're at, right? There's a reason why you're at the company. There's a reason why you're in a team, and a lot of it's to do great work and to be proud of your work. But I would hope some of it's also to engage with your team members, no matter where they're located. Now, that's always been GitHub's MO. And so when change happens, like it always does, and I'm sharing this calendar because I think it helps bring that mental timeline in. We keep our fiscal years are not aligned with the calendar years. So our fiscal year starts in July. So before July of 2019, we made a transition into Microsoft's fiscal year. So that also means we were acquired by Microsoft. No secrets there, right? So you can imagine we're experiencing quite a bit of change. And now we're a separate entity. And so we do operate separately, but at the same time, Microsoft's got some great stuff going for them, right? Like there's a reason why they're a leader, and they also have a high priority and growth mindset and access to resources. So me being in learning and development, when we got access to the Microsoft library, which gives you unlimited access to so many research materials and journals and portals and all of the likes above, I was like, let's jump on board. Now you can imagine that not everyone saw change in that. So that was our first kind of recognition of, all right, there's change coming, we need to operate. In Q1, we really outlined our annual plan. We set some goals like many of you do, but at GitHub, we were a little loosey-goosey, I would say, prior to previous years, and really sticking by our goals because we're reactive, right? We're an open source software company. So it was easy for us to prioritize a lot of things rather than zone into any one direction together. Now on Q2, we're on track. Everything's looking good. We're getting into the holiday season because it gets us into like November and December. We're gearing up for mid-year reflections so that people recognize what they need to be working on in the next fiscal year. Everyone comes back from break. They're excited for the live events that we have coordinated, whether it's learning or maybe it's our external events called Satellite. I know I had been planning an opportunity for all of our managers to come together and learn together from their peers, and COVID happened, and it's not a reality. And so instead of recognizing that change is hard and that we need to abandon, we thought about how can we make this, how can we lean into our remote first, foundation here. And so we had to think a lot differently. And now let's be real. The emotional stress that COVID created is valid. We all as humans felt this. And so not giving it space to have discussions would be an injustice. We have forums on Slack that talk about pets. Of course, we're going to have forums that also talk about, hey, burnout is real right now, because while maybe your peers or family are slowing down and are still handling this, we were gearing up. We were moving as fast as we ever were because we were already working from home. But we were learning a lot in the mix too. We were learning a lot, especially as myself included, someone that typically goes into our HQ office in San Francisco, what it's like to be full-time remote. I know for me, I'm still struggling to get all my steps in that I typically would get. I'm struggling to not see my peers on a regular basis, that for those, coffee chats or whatever it may be, it feels a lot more intentional. And then as we got into Q4, as soon as we were feeling really comfortable with the uneasiness of, this is our new working environment, the anti-racist and, civil unrest movements were happening. And this is right in the midst of our performance review. How can you expect individuals who have been oppressed for so long to also focus on their regular work and sharing all of the work that they've done? So it's a hard balance. Even being leaders in the remote first space, we didn't know how to handle it, but we did know one thing, that creating community in a virtual space was possible, and it was important. And it was something that we needed to focus on. And so while it was easy to put our heads down and to focus on the track that we have so cleanly laid out in Q2, we needed to create space, and we needed to create opportunities for people to connect together, to think about how they were feeling in this particular moment and to express it, because otherwise it gets bottled up or it just gets pushed on the home life. And think about how vulnerable we are, that we're sharing our backgrounds, we're sharing our home life with so many other people, not having the space to give it justice, to just look at it and make assumptions, felt like a disservice. So we learned a lot. Things got a lot brighter. We saw our global and remote first as an opportunity to really improve. And some of the things we realized is that us friends in San Francisco and HQ weren't doing it right. We weren't modeling the behavior that we were hoping to see, and we were really harming our friends who were remote first. And so what we're seeing now is a priority towards, 1 day a week where there's no meetings, because man, it's so easy to be on back-to-back calls. For me, even right now, I've been on calls since 7 a.m. and I'm looking forward to lunch at some point. So building in time for at least 1 day a week and blocking off time in your calendars. And so some of the things we did learn, or some of the basics that we went back to, were going back to our managers, since we knew that they were kind of the linchpins of our whole organization. And we said, okay, what do you all need? What do you all need? And they said, we can't find the resources, right? So earlier when I referenced, if you're in a meeting and you're writing up notes somewhere, it should go in a repo. Well, no one could find the repo that had the source of truth, or no one could find the resources. So instead of prioritizing what we had regularly had on track, we went back to our foundations and we said, okay, how do we make this more accessible? How do we make sure that it's easier to find? And how do we put it in the hands of those that can have the largest distributing factor here? We also reached out to our communities that were the highest impacted, right? So especially during the civil unrest, reaching out to our ERGs to see how they were feeling and making sure that we were treating them differently than our general population. These are people that were invested in bringing, minorities or underrepresented communities into the forefront and leading their work. And so while we didn't put the pressure on them to solve for this, we did put the pressure on them to express how they felt, because we knew that they needed to share, even if it was just with one another. So making sure they were meeting regularly, and not necessarily about the goals as an ERG or community function, but rather just sharing feelings, which I know I know at least for me growing up was not something that was really encouraged in the workforce, but I would say now is our greatest strength. And then we looked at what is our overall community need. So we sent out some wellness surveys. We asked how people were feeling, and that's how we're making a decision on whether or not to open an office. Because we recognize that for some, it's really hard to work from home. That is no lie, right? Small spaces in San Francisco, or whatever your home life may be, your family running around, it's hard to concentrate. So it's really understanding the comfort, because COVID's not going anywhere anytime soon. But we do want to make sure that our people feel safe and they feel comfortable. Now, the biggest thing is that we brought people together to make our decisions, to make sure they felt heard and felt connected to our community, to support one another, and to really understand the decisions that we were making and how we were making those decisions. So it's hard to do that in any one setting. So it's not like we had one all hands and we brought the LT in and was like, all right, here's rolling up our sleeves. Here's what's going on, gang. It took multiple efforts to make sure that we were communicating on our decisions around COVID, communicating on how we're supporting ERGs, communicating how we're supporting our managers, and also involving them into those communications so they can be ambassadors of that work. So it was really important that we thought about all these different mechanisms, and we brought them together in meetings like this. In meetings where we were talking in a broader sense, that we were learning something new, but we were really prioritizing the smaller discussions so that people felt like they had peers to go to, especially if it was not necessarily the most comfortable to go to their manager or skip level or whatever it may be. Now, we also, keep in mind, we're going back to our Q4, we had a culture change that we were trying to address through a lot of this. And it helped us double down that we wanted remote first, but it also helped us realize that there's some values coming in with this new team, right? With Microsoft being, partners to GitHub. And so we hosted some World Cafes. If you're not familiar with World Cafes, Google it, it's great. And it can be done virtually. I was talking to Dan and Tamira earlier. Thank you so much for your help. And we were acknowledging that creating, an experience that went really well live is not one for one when you're trying to make it virtual, but it is possible. I promise you it is. It may take a little more time. So that 45-minute meeting may now be an hour and a half, but the value you're going to get from it is going to be so much more impactful, depending on your goals, of course. Now, with that, we enhanced our programs for our virtual audience, creating some access to some purely HQ exclusive benefits. So before, we had a gym on site, which is like quite a luxury, I recognize. But we now offer those classes online, and we also offer them to the kiddos, right? So their parents at home also have a chance to just put their kid in front of the screen, go do kiddo yoga for a little bit. Well, mom and dad can take care of some of the work that needs to get done. Our happy hours on that typically happened on Fridays in the office turned into virtual happy hours where people shared cocktail recipes and just had an opportunity to decompress from the week. You're welcome to bring any beverage or food of choice. But the thought is making time for these opportunities of connections was huge. We also made sure we were staggering our learning outcomes. So that manager experience, it was supposed to be a week long, really 3 days, let's be real, because nothing happens on Mondays and Fridays. That week long experience wasn't going to be possible. We couldn't cover all of that content virtually. It's burnt out. I mean, I even see it in this conversation, right? Like there's only so long you can be talked at without being able to engage. So we're really mindful that we wanted to still bring forward the important parts of that experience, but it had to be separated differently. So each day had its own theme. And we gave the team members some autonomy on when it worked for them, but we also communicated to the rest of the organization and said, hey, look, your managers are prioritizing learning and development this week. If they have to push out their meetings, it's nothing personal, but it's hopefully to help them be better managers for you. So help them, give them the space to learn. And we also made sure that it was fun. So while yes, there was keynotes from our leadership team, and there was, learnings that we brought in from various vendors, at the end of the week, we had a trivia session where each round was hopefully something different, but one round was very strategically all related to that week's learning. So you can do it fun, right? Like you can use Zoom in fun ways to push people into breakout rooms. And now I know that not everyone is on Zoom, right? But I do know that there's free instances of it. So recognize that you can still take opportunities to make learning a virtual experience without losing what you had in that first person-first experience. Another thing that we noticed is that people are drawn to really clear brands. So you'll notice that on my screen here, we wanted to create an identity for each region, especially since we weren't able to move. So with this identity here, we recognize that you can grow from where you're standing, but together we're stronger. So we created these hexagons knowing that they build upon one another, but they, like you can see in the North America West, we have succulents and cactuses, whereas in APAC, we have more, I think it's the kangaroo paw or whatever the plant is, the national plant for Australia. So we really wanted to embrace our individuality, but how we could come together in a very visual way so that people were reminded that they're represented and they're here and we're here for them. Now through all this, again, we stumbled, we tried something new, we shipped to learn, so we call it. But from this, we found with no surprise that we have, a lot more in common than what we have in differences, no matter where we come from. It was hard for individuals to realize that when they have the pressures of their job, the world around them, all of these things on them on a daily basis, but if we were able to talk to each other like humans and recognize, I have this in the background because this is a passion. I'm really into art. I love talking about it. And it was something that I had never brought forward to myself in that workspace, even though I would say I'm a pretty authentic person, both in and outside of work. But it allows us to recognize that we're bringing a lot more to us, much like this iceberg here, right? What you see on the surface and going from remote, you need to bring forward that sense of empathy, or at least awareness, so that you can grow in empathy. Now, you may hear, we don't have time for games, or, we have too much content to go through. We're just gonna have them attend and they can listen. Please push back. As learning and development professionals, you have an obligation to push back. I promise you it will pay off. Talking to Dan and Tamara earlier too, the biggest thing is engagement, right? It's hard to figure out engagement online. No one fills out surveys. Let's be real. I've never gotten more than 30% back on a survey from a learning experience, and I get that. But if I can get them to talk to one another, if I can get them to share back in this meeting about what they've learned, not only am I hearing how they're engaging and how they're accepting this information, it also cements it, because it forces them to repeat some of the things that they're learning. And it helps me get an idea of what are those things that people are picking up on? What are those aha moments? So I can lean into those same models. So with this, I will offer you one very easy way that I helped Marco and Joseph with today to help make your meetings a little more interactive and an opportunity for people to gain a little space and peers, hopefully, to connect with one another. Because the first thing we heard off this call, and I apologize I didn't catch your name, was it's just nice to talk to someone in a corner, right? I don't know if I can't say I'm the most extroverted person. I think I do well at it, but at the same time at a networking event, I'm along the sides. I'm not in the center of the room. So this is my best practice guide of thinking about how you can make virtual personal. So opening it with the first 2 minutes, setting some guidelines, even creating a text prompt here of saying, hey, one word to describe how you're feeling, and having everyone share it and playing off of that so they can immediately get engaged and recognize their role in this experience. Taking about 8 minutes, please don't do it any less than 8 minutes, because even if you only have 2 people, that's barely enough time to share your name and what's happening to you that day and whatever the prompt is. But if you can keep it smaller than 5, that's the ideal. Again, think about no more than, if you only have 8 minutes, groups 3 or smaller is the ideal. Of course, you're gonna have content for X amount of times, but then at the end, close with that same breakout. Let them reconnect with those individuals to say, hey, what did they learn? I now know them as a human being. What was important to you? Because I heard something different, right? And how can we connect, and how can we put this in, hopefully for accountability as we move forward? So I know, and then at the end, it's 2 minutes to reflect, to hear back what people are saying. Because again, that's a data point for you to help understand the engagement of what's really sticking and what's meaningful. That's 20 minutes. That's 20 minutes. You can add 20 minutes onto any conversation and improve your meetings exponentially. and create community. Because now they've not only connected with you as a facilitator, they've connected with their peers in the room, and they'll hopefully continue that learning on. So with that, that's all I got for you, friends. I'm happy to answer some questions that you may have more interest in remote work culture, but I'm hoping that that was helpful for everyone to see some, or at least my best practices. You can use polling and a bunch of other tools, but 20 minutes or less.
Thank you, Kristina. That was awesome. I love how, while most other companies are trying to just figure out how to operate Zoom and how to like work from not being in the office, GitHub is so ahead, right? Like you're trying to figure out how to do world cafes and kiddo yogas and make remote work more personal. So you're sort of like, yeah, you're definitely ahead as an organization, ahead of many other companies out there. So that was super awesome. And for just for context, the whole experiment about doing breakout rooms in this roundtable, that was all Kristina's fault. So that's where the idea came from. So yeah, thank you for that as well.
Of course.
So any questions? There was a question from Stuart earlier about how many people you have and how they're distributed, and I think Chris answered 1,400. And what's roughly the breakout? Are you lopsided toward North America or HQ or anything like that? Or?
Yeah, I'm able to speak to the manager population much more confidently than the broader, just because that's the work I was closest to before moving into this HRBP role. But largely, you know, I would say about half of our people managers were in North America West. That's anywhere from Seattle to anywhere in California, just about. And then I would say then the next largest population is actually in EMEA, surprisingly, and then North America East, and then APAC. So pretty broadly distributed, obviously not in every country in the world, someday maybe, but yeah, the breakdown, at least in the manager population, which I think is fairly representative across the board. However, I think we may have more pockets of communities based on our sales functionalities, right? So in emerging markets.
Got it. There's a question from Jasmine. What GitHub end up doing to make their materials more discoverable in repositories? And how do you do knowledge management and discoverability?
Yes, great question. We're still working on it. Let's be clear. It's an evolution. But one of the biggest things is we've upgraded our internal communications channel, right? So before we were building, I think, like a wiki off of GitHub, which is basically just like an easier to use web page versus the repo behind it. And we recognize things were connecting. But one of the biggest things we recognize is not only with the upgrade of this new internal tool, we also recognize that managers were our biggest advocate. If they couldn't find what it was, no way their individual contributor could find where it was. So we regularly do pulse checks, and we've now has set the expectation that the leadership team needs to meet with their function at least once a month with managers. So that's our biggest way to say, there's a new page on the internet that talks about promotions or that talks about this. Make sure your team is aware. So we're amplifying it that way. And again, this is new. We've launched it, I want to say, in early January. Perfect timing, though. Thank God. Because I can't imagine us going through this tool without with COVID on top of it, the previous tool. But we try our best, and I'm hoping that our annual engagement survey, we call it the Pulse, we're hoping that that will show that people are finding a little more access to the resources that they need. So verdict's still out, but we're working on it, and we recognize it's a priority, right? It's one of those things that's a non-negotiable, especially in a virtual world.
Got it. A couple more questions. So Sandy asked about automatic note-taking tools for the meetings. Are you using anything like that?
We are not, largely because of security reasons. So we haven't been able to find a tool that we feel confident will not put our customers at risk. So I would not recommend any automatic note-taking, but I would recommend everyone should be coming into that meeting with an async response to the agenda. So the agenda is typically set at least X amount of time in advance, and people are able to respond to that agenda. So the thought is that if we're meeting live, it should be discussion based. It shouldn't be updates. If you're sharing updates in this meeting, you're wasting everyone's time.
Got it. Yeah, yeah. And there's always the issue of discoverability for legal reasons as well. So that's I hear that a lot. I love how your documentation first, and you have such a strong documentation culture. And it's interesting that you're using live one-on-ones or like team meetings to socialize the documentation. So, but then you have this backbone of documentation. So that's really interesting. And again, I know GitHub is so far ahead than many other companies when it comes to documenting things. So that's pretty cool. Cool. So it sounds like there are some more questions. There's some also more answers. And I forgot to mention, but Kristina did speak at 2019, last year's TechKnowCon at Twitter. So Kate, thanks for sharing that
Thanks, Kate.
video. Yeah. And with that, thank you. We'll have more opportunities to interact with you afterwards as well on Slack channels and so on. Yeah. So thank you, Kristina.
Yeah. No, thank you so much, Marco. I apologize. I do have to run after this, but hey, always reach out to me on LinkedIn or Slack, whatever. I'm in the TechKnowCon Slack channel now, so happy to connect with people if you have more questions or want to think about how you can bring virtual more personality to virtual space. So thanks all.
Awesome. Thank you, Kristina.